Today is July 15th, 2022, and I'm Alyze Ahola, and I'll be interviewing Holly Hexter. So go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Holly Hexter. I was born in Dallas on March 30th, 1956, and lived there basically until I went to college. I also lived there for a year following college graduation, and I've been away from Dallas now for about 43 years. So I've actually lived in the DC area now longer than I lived in Dallas, but my roots obviously go very deep in Dallas.
Yes, they do. So tell us about your childhood.
Oh, okay. I thought this was going to be about my grandmother.
Oh, yeah. So we'll get to Ruth, but we,
Okay.
of course, want to know about you too.
Okay. So my childhood was spent, I was deeply steeped in the Jewish community, of course, by virtue of my family having been in Dallas for several generations. And but to be honest, we were not living in a Jewish community. We were not living in a part of Dallas where most of the Jewish community was located at the time, because my parents had decided to build our house on a vacant lot that they found, and they very much wanted us to go to public school, and they thought that the public schools in the Park Cities would be really good, so they opted to live in the Park Cities, which was an interesting decision, since it meant that we grew up attending school mostly with non-Jews, with Gentiles, and our Jewish experience was pretty much our family, our relatives, and my parents' friends, and then of course religious school. But yes, I had what I would consider a very happy childhood, a very privileged childhood, and then left to go to school in the Northeast. But it was I don't think my childhood was very different than most of the people I grew up around in my immediate neighborhood. I don't think it was a typical childhood experience. The longer I've lived and the more I've seen of people's lives, it was really living in a bubble. And but I don't think we were quite aware of that at the time. We were in a very happy bubble. And it was a very secure, loving family.
So what about your family? What was that like when you were younger?
So my family included not just my parents and my brother and my sister, but my grandparents. And then I was lucky enough to also get to know my great-grandmother, my maternal grandmother's mother. And so really my childhood included not just regular visits with my grandparents, but also visiting great aunts and uncles and my great grandmother you know, synagogue. You know, I grew up in Temple Emmanuel, and my family had been deeply involved in the life, well, obviously the life of the Jewish community for a long time. The Hexters had been in Dallas for 4 generations. I was like the 4th generation in my family to be born, or the 3rd generation to be born in Dallas, and then the 4th generation to live in Dallas of my father's family. And my mother's family had come to Dallas when my great-grandfather was hired to come to be a rabbi at Temple Emmanuel in the 20s. So he had been ordained by Isaac Mayer Wise in 1900, and his first congregation was in Dayton, Ohio. And then I think it was either the late teens or the early 20s, he came to Dallas. And so my grandfather on that side had been born in Dayton, but then my mother was born in Dallas. And so, and sadly, I did not know my Lefkowitz great-grandparents. But my Lefkowitz grandparents I spent a lot of time with, as well as my grandmother Can, who had been married to my grandfather Louis Hexter before their divorce, and then she subsequently married Lawrence Can. But the grandmothers were in and out of our house all the time. We were at my grandparents' houses. And as I said, we also spent time going to Maple Terrace Apartments, which was where my great-grandmother and my great-great-aunt and some of their, what we called the blue-haired ladies lived. So we would visit them, and we would go trot around. We'd sort of be trotted around to visit with some of these older folks as well. So it was, I mean, we had a very family-centered life, and I think that I didn't really have so much of a consciousness of what the Jewish community meant to me at that time, because it's sort of like being immersed in anything. When you're immersed in it, you're immersed in it. So you're not conscious of really anything else. But at the same time, there was definitely a divide between my family experience and my parents' experience, having grown up in the Jewish community and having mostly Jewish friends, and then my experience, which was that most of my childhood friends were friends from school who were not Jewish. So there was a little bit of a divide, I would guess. And I wasn't really, some of this I really wasn't conscious of until I grew up and left Dallas. But at the time, it seemed to me when I was very young that these communities were very porous, and that people were intermingled quite easily. And certainly they did that in terms of everyday business, commerce. My family was active in businesses, but also active in civic organizations. And my great-grandfather Hexter was a city councilman and chair of the school board, the Dallas School Board. My grandmother Can founded a few civic organizations. The Hexters were very involved in the formation and the move of the Temple Emmanuel to its existing site. And my great aunt and great uncle, I believe, kind of underwrote made it possible, the first support that made it possible to build the new synagogue where it is today. But they were also really involved in the life of the sisterhoods and the management of the, and just enormously involved in Jewish organizations. Again, I just sort of accepted that was what people did, because that just seemed to be what you do if you're growing up in a certain community. And but I don't have that. My kids do not have that experience that I had, which was growing up in having a very rich childhood because of my ability to spend so much time with my extended family. And I do think that was something that I really was fortunate to have. And that was definitely a big part of it. A lot of the family events were at my grandparents', and then as they got older, it shifted to our house for, holidays, including, Thanksgiving, Passover. Probably not atypical of some Jewish families in Dallas. We celebrated both Hanukkah and Christmas. When I tell people outside this Dallas or the South about this, they are aghast. They cannot believe it. They don't understand how that could be. And so I had to explain to them that this was just part of what was a pretty assimilated Jewish life for a lot of families in Dallas. And I think it was true elsewhere in the South and the Southwest. It was just, unless you were conservative or Orthodox. And I certainly didn't know of any Orthodox Jews in Dallas. But it was a way of sort of blending in. You were certainly first and foremost attentive to your own religious traditions and your own faith, but then gave a nod to the fact that we were living in a predominantly Christian society. And so I don't think it had at the time, it didn't seem to us that there was anything religious about, getting Christmas presents or going over to our great aunt and uncles, on Christmas Day or something like that. But we definitely tended to be the household where the family Passover was held, where we lit the lights for Hanukkah and exchanged small gifts, and of course had break fasts a couple of times after the high holidays. So I think we were also a very close-knit family. We were really fortunate in that regard. So I think that's all I want to say about that.
Okay. So let me ask you a little bit more about Ruth. What was Ruth like?
She was just an awesome woman. She was a force of nature to everyone, and including her grandchildren. She was such an influential person in my life. She took us on our first international travel. She took us to the symphony, to the opera, to art exhibits. Not that my mother wasn't also involved and in sort of the cultural life of Dallas, but my grandmother took it as sort of a personal crusade that she was going to introduce her grandchildren to all of these things. And so I think that she had maybe three main missions as far as her grandchildren were concerned. One was that we be observant and be appreciative, be good Zionists. That was pretty interesting. One, that was something I was aware of later when we, the second was that we really expose ourselves as much as possible to ideas and music and art and cultures, and not just our own culture, but those of others. And she took us to Mexico and to Asia, and she made it possible for me to go to Europe. And she was always very well informed about current events, and she made it clear that it was really, really important to be both engaged in civic organizations, to be part of a community, to be doing your share, and also to be as informed as possible. And I think she felt that Jews had a special obligation to remain vigilant because of our history, and that we couldn't afford to be complacent. Because keep in mind, when I was growing up, we were really still in the shadow of the Holocaust, and that really dominated a lot of the curriculum. I've told people that who are very surprised that there wasn't some reaction against or denial in the wake of the Holocaust and the Second World War. They were sort of surprised to hear that. But actually, my religious education, there was a lot of focus on anti-Semitism and the perils of that. And so she was, she made us aware of the role that she and her second husband, Lawrence Kahn, had played in helping relatives get out of Germany. And she was very generous. I think she made it clear that she felt that whatever means she had, whatever resources, both her own resources and talents and her financial resources, were to be shared in support of the larger community. And I can't even begin to tell you how many organizations she was involved with. She was a little bit of ahead of her time in the sense that I think had she been alive a couple of generations later, she definitely would have been a professional woman rather than a kind of a volunteer and philanthropist. But she was not your doting grandmother who was just sitting around. She just was active every minute, and her activism and her energy and her wide-ranging interests were really inspirational. They certainly broadened my horizons. And so she just had an enormous impact on me. And I think she was a very dominating personality and very highly opinionated. And I think that was not always easy. But she was an amazing, wonderful woman. And the third concern of hers, in addition to being dedicated to the life of Judaism and to protecting Israel and Israel's right to exist, was making sure that family connections remained intact. She spent a lot of time communicating with, corresponding with various family members throughout the country and encouraging her children and grandchildren to be connected to family members, and documenting family events. And I think that's where the archival part of it comes in, is that she really had a deep appreciation for the importance of photographs and other documents as part of, compiling a history of individuals and organizations and families and communities. So that's what I have to say about her.
And what about Louis? What about your grandfather?
He's an even more complex person to talk about. I don't know what you've heard already. I listened for the first time. I listened for the first time to what's in your archive, the oral history. I had not heard that before. I've read some of his letters. It's hard for me to separate now my own experience growing up with him and then what I've learned since then. He's really, really a very complicated person. It seems to me that he's somebody who had all the benefits and privilege of a person in his community, and he tried to act as though some of that wasn't really all that important to him, or that he could just kind of reject it out of hand, or even to some extent disassociate himself or make fun of it. So I think he saw himself as kind of a bohemian. I think he saw himself as an outsider, and yet he was a fundamental insider. I mean, he was in the family title business. He after he got his law degree, I mean, he came back to Texas and definitely used his law degree there, and was involved in real estate and other business transactions or whatever. He, like my grandmother, as a grandfather, really felt that he had a crusade to expose us to the right things. And like, he was also interested in music and theater and art. I would say, especially in theater, he was very dedicated to sort of the life of theater, and he had put some of his resources toward starting something called the Dallas Little Negro Theater or something like that. It was one of the first of its kind, and they launched I believe it was an all-Black performance of Porgy and Bess. He sort of liked to sort of go outside the bounds of, sort of push the envelope, and that was considered very controversial apparently when he did this in the 30s, I think it was, to help stage these and form a company that was made of Black actors. And then he also backed some movies and some plays outside of the Dallas area. So, and he felt it was important, like my grandmother, for us to get out of Dallas and to see life beyond. And so he took my cousin and me to the World's Fair in New York in whatever that was, 64, I guess. And took us to Radio City Music Hall. And anyway, he was big on pushing beyond what he regarded as kind of sort of ridiculous boundaries or conventions. And he was frankly pretty contemptuous of people like my grandmother, from whom he was divorced, whom he thought was, just way too conventional. And I think the term he used was bourgeois. And he also applied that to my parents. They were bourgeois. And, I didn't learn until later that he really was not very nice to my parents. My father came back after college and law school outside of Texas. He came back into the family business. My grandfather was then the head of the family title business, and he basically made it impossible for my father to stay in the business. He pretty much kicked my father out of the business onto his own. And from what I understood, he was extremely competitive with his son, my father, and tried to undermine him, both personally and professionally. And so he was not successful in personal relationships. As a grandchild, I knew categorically he was devoted to me. So I saw less of the difficult side of him. I think he might have reacted to the fact that he had parents who were like pioneers in the Jewish community and then in the greater Dallas community, and he was damned if he was gonna just follow in their footsteps and just do the right thing or whatever. He just saw himself as someone who was kind of an iconoclast and was daring to march to his own drummer. So that's what I'll say about that.
What about Lawrence? Did you ever meet Lawrence?
No, sadly, Lawrence died about 10 years before I was born.
Oh, okay.
But I know that from what I've heard, that my grandmother was very happy in her second marriage, and sadly, it did not last very long because Lawrence died in, I believe it was 47.
So let's talk a little bit more about yourself. What about Dallas? Do you still have any connections other than maybe your family?
I have some cousins. I have some high school friends, some friends from Sunday school. But sadly, there are really practically no friends of my parents or grandparents who are still alive. So there are a few connections. One of my parents' oldest friends, and the last of the Pollocks, Rob Pollock, died recently. And I don't think that there are, I really can't think of many of my old family friends who are, still there. So my connection is mostly through people my age, who are not family members, but, whom I went to high school with. So I don't really have very close ties anymore, sadly.
What did you do for work?
So I was a reporter for about a year in the Dallas area, right out of college. And I worked for the Belo company, which owned the Dallas Morning News and all of these suburban papers. So I worked in Garland and Irving. And that was really cool in the sense that I got to cover a health and education beat. And I really, really liked being an education reporter. So I did that for about a year. And then I decided that I wanted to A, study abroad, because I hadn't done that as an undergrad, and B, that I wanted to move to New York or Washington where my college friends were. So I actually picked up and moved to Washington and was first a freelance writer and then an education reporter for a company that published newsletters in education and social services. Then I became a policy analyst for a higher ed association. And then for the last 22 years, I've been a consultant for another higher ed association based in DC that focuses on helping kids who are first in their families to go to college and to graduate from college. So we represent colleges and universities that host programs like Upward Bound and other federally funded college access and retention programs. So that's pretty much been my work for the last more than 2 decades. And a couple of fun things I get to do are run a national internship program that brings college students, low-income first-gen students, to DC to be interns, and also a short-term study abroad program that, again, sends low-income college students from all over the country for a short-term summer program in Europe. And that is what I've been doing for work.
That's really cool. So are you currently married?
I'm not. I'm divorced. I was married for 29 years. I'm now single, but in a happy relationship with someone who oddly also grew up in Dallas. And we met through mutual friends. He and his late wife both grew up in Dallas, but they were members of Shereth Israel. And they were also a little bit older. So I think the only family we decided we knew in common were the Beers of Dallas, Jerry and Bob Beer, who were good friends of my grandmother. And so it's kind of a funny connection. But no, I'm not presently married, but I have 2 wonderful adult children.
Oh, that's really nice. And are you still active in the Jewish community?
I guess it sort of depends on your definition of active. I certainly am not as active as my grandparents, or maybe even as my mother was, in terms of national organizations, but I'm really involved in the Temple Micah community here in Washington, D.C. And so I joined, my then husband and I joined this congregation when our first child was young, and it's been even after the kids, left religious school, graduated from religious school, and it became important to me to be in that community. And so I was involved with the American Jewish Committee in a way because my ex-husband was head of the AJC here, the Washington office in AJC here in DC. And so during our marriage and during his work with AJC, I was involved in supporting events that AJC sponsored, and the programming, the programming and the conferences. And so kind of by extension, I was involved in that organization. And I guess I've been involved with HIAS a little bit in terms of supporting refugees, and also with, sort of the just locally resettling of some Afghan families and everything. In terms of other organizations, some contributions, but not leadership, not the kind of leadership of previous generations of my family.
So what's one thing you want people to remember about you?
I think it's important to remember that you're a product of all that came before you, and to have an appreciation of your history and the history of your community, and not that defines you, but it's certainly part and parcel of who you are. And so whether I like it or not, Dallas is a big part of who I am. And certainly the very rich life that I had, the family life I had, and my involvement in the Jewish community, even if I didn't think about it as being involved in the Jewish community at that time, that was certainly part of a big part of my identity. And I guess I'm still, as an adult, trying to figure out what exactly that means. What it is that we do, what it is that we inherit that's important to us, and how can we make our mark, given the fact that, compared to previous generations, we're not pioneers. We're not struggling to establish ourselves in a new place, or not struggling to find resources. What does it mean to do that? So I sort of think, as I was texting my kids the other day, we were texting about WIP and work in progress. And I said, well, I think everyone is really a work in progress. And so I guess I feel lucky to have had the family that I've had and to have been given the resources and the encouragement to explore the wider world, and also the value of having had a really good education has impressed upon me the importance of making sure that all people have access to an education. I think that's really something that's been a big family value, and it remains a high, just a supreme value of mine, that that people have access to education and healthcare regardless of their background or their income. And I don't feel all that hopeful at this moment about the general condition of our society, but I do feel hopeful that there are still organizations and institutions, and there is a faith that I'm part of whose values are still really important to reinforce in the wider society. And so, yeah, I'm not really sure how to end it, but I guess I'd like to be an optimist, but I'm not feeling particularly optimistic at the moment.
Well, that was really good. I appreciate that. That's all I had for you today. It's really good to speak to you. Yes.
All right. Well, I hope that I got in enough about, I feel like I didn't say enough about my kids and my hopes for them, but I think the one thing that I think I said was that they had a very different experience since they didn't grow up in the same community that their grandparents did. And so they didn't have that kind of rich experience that I did. And I'm sorry, I'm sorry that they don't have that. But I know that they both feel connected to Dallas and to the Jewish community by virtue of their family roots. So thank you. It was really nice talking to you.
Of course, it was nice talking to you too.
Take care.
You too. Do you have any questions for Jessica?
I just have to think about like the way in which this is going to be used, whether, video versus just audio. Let me think about that.
Of course, of course.
And I know that there was something I was supposed to sign, so I'll look at her email and figure out, I'll look at that now and fill out whatever paperwork she wanted me to fill out.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, thank you so much.
And enjoy your summer. Are you doing a lot of these?
This is my second interview.
Ah.
Yeah.
And how long are you interning at DJHS?
Until I think the second week of August.
Uh-huh. And where are you from, Dallas?
No, I'm not from Dallas. I am from Texas, just not Dallas.
Oh, where did you grow up?
In West Texas and Midland, Texas.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah.
So what made you decide you wanted to intern for the society?
So I was looking for somewhere to intern, and my counselor, she sent me a form with the Jewish Family Services where they do an internship program.
Uh-huh.
And DJHS was one of the options, and I chose them.
And why?
I don't really know why. It just sounded interesting to me, and now I'm really interested in it.
Uh-huh. Well, cool. I mean, did you grow up with a Jewish background, or?
No, I'm actually Latino.
Ah.
Yeah.
So you're maybe learning a lot about the Jewish community in Dallas. I mean, right?
Yeah, I have learned a lot about them.
Yeah. Well, one of the interesting things about moving to a different part of the country is that you learn that Jews in like the Northeast don't think that, they don't believe that Jews in Texas were really Jews. Like, because of their assimilation, they, they think that, okay, you weren't really Jewish. If you were raised as a Reformed Jew in Texas, that means you probably weren't really Jewish. And, so it's pretty interesting because, like, nobody's going to say to you, you're not really Latina, right?
Yeah.
But if you're a Jew from Texas, and particularly if you're a Reformed Jew as opposed to being conservative or Orthodox or whatever, you will have people tell you, oh, well, you're not really Jewish. It's just like, just dismissing like whatever your your family background or your traditions or whatever. And they may not look like that of someone who grew up in a Jewish family in New York, for instance, or Philadelphia or whatever. But, there are Jewish experiences of all kinds, just as you would say that there are probably, Latino experiences. They're not everyone in Florida is a Cuban immigrant, right? Or whatever, like part of a Cuban community, or the Hispanic community in Texas is not all just one community, it's, so it's interesting, but.
Yeah, it is.
Wonderful. Today is June 28th, 2024. I am Jessica Adams, and I am recording an oral history interview addendum with Holly Hexter.
It was a lot of fun to do the interview. I don't know whether that was 3 or 4 years ago or it was. But at the end of it, I don't know if you remember, but we had an exchange about the fact that I felt I totally glossed over, an important aspect of Dallas history at that time, that was relevant, certainly relevant to my childhood experience. And I think I was just concerned that not to mention that would be sort of distorting the record, because I think I was eager to emphasize that, because of my family's history in Dallas and the roles they occupied within the Jewish community and the larger community, I felt pretty secure in my identity. But the fact of the matter is that my parents chose to bring us up in a part of Dallas that was not where Jews lived. I felt that I would be remiss not to mention one aspect of my experience growing up in Dallas that may or may not be shared by other Dallas Jews, that that despite my feeling secure in my own Jewish identity, based on the fact that my family had been extremely active in the Jewish community and had been in Dallas for several generations, there's no question that there were anti-Semitic incidents I experienced, and there was, I would say, most of the time rather subtle form of sort of tacit, not overt anti-Semitism, but just basically due to the fact that my parents decided to build a house in the Park Cities, and consequently there were not a lot of Jewish families in that part of Dallas, and I think it was driven in part by the desire to have their kids go to public schools. They had both been to private schools for high school, and many of their friends, their childhood friends in Dallas, their Jewish friends, were sending their kids to private school, and they really wanted to just go to public school. And so the reputation of the public schools in the Park Cities was quite good. But I think the main lure was that my father, who was a builder and developer, really wanted to build his own house. And so when they found an available lot, a corner lot that was a very prized lot, he collaborated with E.G. Hamilton of Hamilton and Harrell, and they built what became a really, I didn't realize it at the time, but it was a very significant mid-century modern house. And so what went with that was just being in a community where a lot of people, most people were not Jewish. And in fact, I would say a number of them belonged to kind of an evangelical strain of Protestantism. And so they had pretty definite ideas about Jews, and they didn't allow their clubs, they did not allow their clubs to be open to Jews. And so for years I went to functions at school functions, mixers, that sort of thing, at the Dallas Country Club without ever realizing that it was restricted. It was really only after I left Dallas that I learned that I had been, that I had been attending events there, but that had I wanted to, or had my family wished to join, we would not have been able to. And I really don't know whether that's been lifted. I know that a college classmate of mine petitioned to become, and did become after 13 years, the first African-American member of the Dallas Country Club. So that was pretty interesting. Neelan Youngblood. And I have yet to talk to him about that experience. But in any case, there was this kind of 6 o'clock curtain that others have written about in terms of the history of Jews in Dallas, in that, while the Jewish families were really obviously prominent in commerce, and, were quite influential as merchants, when you think about Stanley Marcus or Teich or Harris, Leon Harris of Sanger Harris, or Alex Sanger of Sanger Harris. These were really influential people. And yet, at the end of the day, they weren't able to really socialize across, again, the social spheres were quite distinct on some level. And so I think that how that affected me was, well, there were a couple of incidents where I remember in middle school, a classmate throwing a penny down on the floor in the classroom in social studies, and saying, "Jew, pick up the penny," which was shocking to me because I really didn't know it. I didn't know anything. I didn't know where that came from. I'd never heard that from anyone, and I hadn't heard anything hostile from any of my classmates before that. And then when I got to high school, I had 2 guys in my high school class tell me that, hey, they would love to ask me out, but of course their parents would never permit it because I was Jewish. So even though I thought that I kind of sailed along under the radar, I was not someone who was proclaiming, my Jewishness. it was obviously evident and known by my classmates and their families. I also remember being asked to join a conversation in the high school cafeteria. Mind you, this was early 70s, Highland Park High School. They had meetings of Young Life, the group Young Life, in the cafeteria. And they actually had professionals who were coming in and meeting with students. And a friend of mine suggested that I go along. I had no idea what Young Life was. And then I got there and it turned out to be an effort. You know, it was proselytizing, pure and simple, because my friend was, you know, really deathly afraid that I was going to go to hell, and told me that this was a chance to redeem myself. And, you know, there were other things that were more subtle, perhaps, although they should have been offensive at the time. But, you know, there were prayers that were Christian prayers that were given over the PA system all through from grade school on up to high school. I think by the time my sister came along 6 years later, um, it was clear that the school system had totally disregarded the Supreme Court ruling of 1962 regarding prayer in the classroom. But there was a group in her cohort who got enough outraged, and maybe they had some parents behind them to say, this is just not appropriate to be having prayers, you know, over the PA system and saying, in Jesus' name we pray. Not to mention the prayers at the pep rallies, at the football games, et cetera, et cetera. And so there was the more I thought about it, the more very heavily Christian overlay, with zero awareness of how that might affect people who were not Christian, practicing Christians. So I think that, as I said, I just wanted to emphasize that I think there were many wonderful things about my own experience growing up in Dallas and being part of an amazing community. But until I thought about it recently, I realized that I do not want to give the impression that anti-Semitism was not present, was not working. And it's a pretty long through line, the racism and the anti-Semitism, the bigotry in Dallas history. And I don't know whether I mentioned it before, but my great-grandfather Lefkowitz, who was rabbi of Temple Emmanuel, he arrived from Dayton in 1920. And during the 20s, the Klan was ascendant in Dallas. I think they had one of the largest chapters of the KKK. And it really took a coalition of the Dallas Morning News publisher, the Dealys, and a very ecumenical group, interfaith group of ministers. My great-grandfather, as a rabbi of Temple Emmanuel, working against the Klan and against law enforcement, against actually elected officials who were kind of turning the other cheek or whatever, or turning a blind eye, rather. So this is not something new. It's just part and parcel of what makes the city, the history of the city so complex and and, you know, there are many, many things to be proud of, but there also have always been elements of sort of darker elements of bigotry. And that's without even getting into the hysteria and the really, really dark moments that led up to the climate that in which the JFK assassination occurred in 1963 when I was a second grader. So anyway, I really appreciate it, Jessica, the opportunity to just, for the record, to say that this is something that I think many Jews have had to contend with, even as they have been assimilated into many aspects of Dallas life. It was certainly a feature of mine and was a slight social obstacle, but I think, anyway, I know it's something too that is quite topical because sadly, it's not just a matter of historical record. There are incidents of anti-Semitism in Dallas and elsewhere that have been documented, and we find ourselves once again in a time where we have to try to address these challenges and try to bring communities together. So.
Thank you very much, Holly, for sharing all of that. We agree that sharing the most accurate historical record and your personal experiences are definitely among those. We want to make sure we preserve what is actually happening, and we really value your perspective.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great.
All right. Take care.
Take care. Have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.